Well, hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today is November 15th, which is National Clean Out Your Fridge Day. So if anyone that has kids knows it desperately needs a refresh. So this was actually created by Whirlpool in 1999 to encourage people to clean out the refrigerators in advance of the upcoming holidays. And believe it or not, at that time, the company even had a toll-free hotline for people that could call for cleaning tips. So if you need some cleaning tips, the Kroll CTI team can extend our expertise to the fridge IoT. Just an FYI. I am delighted to be able to speak with you today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity. My name is Keith Wojcieszek. I'm the Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll and based in DC. I've been with Kroll for about 6 years, and prior to this, I worked for the US Secret Service, where I was able to have the opportunity to lead the service's cyber threat intelligence program. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We are using GoToWebinar for the presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and the presenters will address questions at the end. If we're able to, we will type in questions during the presentation or may answer them during. So we will get to all the questions that are answered or asked. So Kroll carried out over 3,000 engagements in 2022. Today, we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has collected and highlighting what we have seen during the third quarter of 2023. We are in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. We have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, varieties of industries, and work with over 85 insurance carriers. This gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines. So in this session, we're going to cover the cyber threat landscape with a focus on quarter three. So we saw a 5% increase in attacks against the professional services sector, remaining the top impacted sector for the third quarter in a row. We also saw a 13% increase in email compromise attacks, remaining the top threat incident type. So additionally, in this quarter, we saw a big spike in social engineering as initial access method. The team will dive deeper into what that means and what we're seeing later in the presentation. So we're very fortunate to have leading Kroll experts join us today to go into more detail on the threat landscape. We're joined by Laurie Iacono, George Glass, and Ryan Hicks. Laurie is the Associate Managing Director who manages the day-to-day functions for the Cyber Threat Intel team, including the support of active incident response engagements. Prior to Kroll, Laurie managed the Brand and Consumer Protection Program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or the NCFTA, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George is a Senior Vice President in the Cyber Risk Practice, responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform used to power a managed detection and response service through clients around the globe. Ryan is a Senior Associate in the Cyber Risk Practice and applies the latest threat actor intelligence to our proprietary XDR platform. Before joining Kroll, Ryan delivered strategic and technical cyber threat intelligence to operations worldwide through supporting the Royal Air Force Special Operations Command and incident response. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Laurie to give us more insight into the cyber threat landscape. Laurie?
Thanks, Keith, for that introduction. And, I always start these sessions kind of giving a little bit of background on our methodology and some of the data that you're going to see in the rest of the report. So if you're joining us for the first time, thank you for joining us. And as I said, to give you a little bit of background, so you're going to see a lot of numbers and graphs today. And all of those graphs that you're going to see are based on intelligence from our cyber incident response engagements. So this is, some kind of an event where Kroll has been engaged to either respond, manage, or mitigate some type of incident on a client's network. So we look at these numbers on a monthly basis. The data that you're going to see today is based on Q3. And, as we develop a theme or a topic that we really cover in these quarterly sessions, we also look at other things. So we're looking at, the data that we're drawing from our incident response cases. We're overlaying that with what George and Ryan's team are seeing on the XDR side of things. And we're also overlaying that with what we're seeing in open source cyber threat landscape reporting during that quarter, as well as what our team, Keith and I's team, are seeing, threat actors talking about on the dark web. So that's really the basis of our report and what we're going to cover today. So if we go into the next section here, we always kind of front load with a lot of numbers. So the first thing we're going to cover is our sector analysis and threat incident types for the third quarter. And as Keith mentioned earlier, we did see a 5% increase of events impacting the professional services sector. As I mentioned before, this is from our cases. We continue to see in our casework that professional services is a top targeted sector. Our definition of business or of professional services includes things like business service firms, professional staffing firms, law firms, and real estate firms or property management companies. Of that, we typically are seeing business services and law firms kind of, take the top spot within that category for targeting of what we're seeing. We are also, we did see as well an uptick in incidents this particular quarter impacting the manufacturing sector. And although it's not on this chart, kind of tied into that, we also saw an uptick in incidents involving the construction sector as well. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about that and why we think that threat actors likely think that those are favorable targets for them. For both of those sectors, what we were seeing was be a lot of business email compromise or email compromise attacks. So one of the reasons that might be playing out with those two sectors is think of manufacturing and construction sector. Those are two kind of sectors that rely on a lot of third parties and suppliers. So you're going to have a lot of, it could be ripe for fake invoice fraud, right? Because they have a lot of vendors and suppliers that are really driving their business. Also, companies like that tend to have a large attack surface. Sometimes too, with construction, you may have people that are actually, in the field, they're not in an office, so they're in the field kind of responding to things on the fly. And there could also be a perception from threat actors that these are weaker sectors from kind of a cybersecurity sophistication perspective. And also there, from the ransomware front, if you're able to encrypt sectors like manufacturing or constructions, you may be able to halt critical operations that are now, really costing the victim network money every time that, every day goes by that those operations aren't able to function. Now you're costing them money. So there could be a strong belief from at least ransomware games that could be a sectors that would be likely to pay a ransom. Now, speaking of ransomware, when we go into our next slide here, we're going to look specifically at some of the threat incident types that we were seeing in Q3. Now, we continue to see an uptick in email compromise. As you can see in Q3, the number jumped up about 13% from the second quarter. So we're also kind of, we have seen too, because when we look at this data, it's always like, okay, well, this is our numbers. Is this some kind of bias in our data? And that's where we really look to a lot of open source reporting to, kind of, signal to us, is this something that just we're seeing, or is there a bias there, or is this something that we're kind of seeing in the greater landscape? And reporting in Q3 has kind of, reinforced that this is something that a lot of firms are seeing, that there is this increase in email compromise. And we'll talk about that more specifically a little later, especially actors bypassing MFA methods. We have seen a lot of these business email compromise attacks targeting the financial sector as well, was something that we saw in our data. Now you can see a dip there when it comes to ransomware, but when we look at, we're reporting here on percentages. So this is like a total percentage of cases. And when we look back at case numbers through the last year and compared them to this year, we're seeing those numbers of ransomware attacks be consistent. It's just that, as I said, because there was more email compromise in our casework, that kind of brought that percentage drop. But it's not evidence that ransomware actors aren't they're still consistent, they're still attacking. We always say generally there's a small dip in Q3, sometimes maybe because of vacations that threat actors may take in certain parts of the world. And we usually see an increase in our case, work in Q4. I think if you're watching any headlines now about ransomware, you're probably seeing an uptick in reporting like that, and we'll be watching when we do the Q4 report if we see that uptick again this year. So if we go into our next section here, we're going to talk a little bit more about the numbers, but before we get into that, I want to kind of focus, the rest of our presentation is really going to focus on social engineering, because both as we looked at our numbers and as we looked at, those other things that I mentioned, open source, what we're seeing in XDR, what we're seeing on the dark web, we kept coming back to social engineering really being the theme of the quarter. So, I want to get us on the same page with what social engineering is. So Keith, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a definition of social engineering.
Yeah, social engineering has been tough, especially in the recent days and months with everything that's going on. But I believe there is a big misconception for social engineering. Social engineering itself is not a cyber attack. Rather, it's more of a tactic that is used by these bad guys to gain trust from victims, in order to collect the information so they can perform the cyber attack itself. So, I think that misconception is held throughout. But understanding what social engineering is vital to be able to protect it.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, it's really not, social engineering specifically isn't a cyber threat. It's, kind of a tactic that they're using. And in Q3, we saw really like increases in multiple different categories of initial access. And if we move to that next slide, we can kind of see that specifically. And, social engineering is any time that, a threat actor is doing something to manipulate a human into doing what they want, right? Clicking that link, uploading that attachment, doing something so that they can, bring some kind of malicious activity into the network. And we saw increases in phishing in the third quarter. And phishing, obviously, that's, an obvious one. They're, trying to get humans to click on their bait. So some of the things we saw, like they're doing new things to try to get them to do that, right? So like the use of QR codes in emails. We also saw things like Ryan's going to talk about, seeing links go through Microsoft Teams. So it's not phishing through email, but it's phishing through an instant messaging platform. So, these kind of evolving ways that they're trying to hack humans. Valid accounts is another one. So we saw definitely an uptick in cases that came back to, starting with valid accounts. And many times the way that actors get those valid accounts is maybe previously there was some kind of phishing email or some kind of attempt where they were socially engineering a victim into giving up those usernames and passwords. And then finally, there was a last category here that we had, we just have a kind of a blanket category for social engineering. And usually that doesn't make our top initial access method chart, but this time it did, and we saw an increase there. And that, that would include things like phishing via voice, so like phishing via voice messages, smishing, so phishing via text messages, callback phishing, which we have a case study for that later in the session. And then also, in addition to, all of these tactics to get into networks, we're seeing once they're in, they're using other methods to bypass standard security controls. So we're going to talk a little bit later about MFA prompt bombing and some of the things that actors are doing to overcome the controls that people are trying to put into place to deter all of this from happening. Now, we can't really talk about Q3 without, one of the big headline making stories of Q3 was the group, we're following this group as Kroll threat actor 243, but they're also more, known as scattered spider, scattered swine, octo tempest, depending on who's reporting on them. And that group was, using these social engineering tactics to gain access to some pretty high profile victims throughout the quarter. And I'm gonna, I kind of want Ryan and George to talk a little bit about, that group, what we're seeing from what we're tracking, and a little bit about some of their tactics and techniques.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. So yeah, KJ243, kind of our internal tracking name, really, as you say, been prominent in the social engineering field, really, particularly in the last few months. There have been quite a lot of reporting, particularly in open source, on their activities. They primarily really target actual data for itself for exfiltration, selling that for the kind of financial gain. But actually quite recently, they've also been linked to data extortion as well as ransomware deployment. So really kind of expanding their objectives. And some of the tactics that they've pursued is persuading employees to install remote management tools. So it's a fairly old technique, but something that they do quite prominently. Directly calling an organization help desk to socially engineer the teams to reset users' passwords, or perhaps even changing the multi-factor authentication method for the individuals, so they can then access it through their own devices. And then perhaps on the more kind of threatening side for this group, they have been seeing SMS phishing employees directly with personal messages with things like they're going to send people around to their houses, and a lot of kind of really personal kind of threats and long kind of message chains directly to the victims, really to try and persuade them and put pressure on them to provide over their login details to access their account, which of course is really heightening the pressure on users when they're getting these messages through.
I think one of the interesting things about this group is how young they are in general. It's a fairly loose-knit group in some cases. And interestingly, it's how this group is recruited. There's a term for this amongst these people called beaming, which is sort of specializing in taking over accounts typically related to gaming. So we're talking about things like Minecraft and Roblox to take over that account, maybe mine it for things that are able to be sold later on, but also to recruit members into that group by saying, we can give you your account back, but would you like to learn how to do this? And so these criminals tend to be fairly young, and they are made up of people that have been doing this on a smaller scale for quite some time, but have necessarily had to build up these social engineering skills to be able to conduct these sorts of attacks. So if we move on to taking a bit of a closer look on the intrusion lifecycle of KTA-243, there's two main areas where they're using social engineering. It'd take too long to go through the entire attack cycle, but of course, as we've been saying, the initial access often is gained by social engineering, callback phishing, pretending to be a help desk employee, SIM swapping, all of those sorts of things, SMS phishing, but also for privilege escalation as well. So once they have access to the network, they can easily social engineer other people to provide them the access that they may need to access other areas of the network, access cloud environments, and so on and so forth. Finally, I think one of the things that's most important to know about this group is they are actually also involved in ransomware deployment. And one of those particular types of ransomware is BLACKCAT. So I'll hand it back over to Laurie now to take us through a case study involving that group.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to talk about this BLACKCAT ransomware story. And, I also want to touch on, George mentioned the young age of this group. I don't know if there's any parents on the phone, but I have a middle schooler, and I can't believe that, essentially like account takeover is almost like a hobby for young people today, because they're trying to take over and hijack each other's social media accounts and things like that. And, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been a whole different ballpark, but for them, it's really normal. So I don't know what that's going to say about the future of cybercrime, but certainly right now we're seeing a lot of cases with the nexus of what appears to be very young threat actors. So, as George and Ryan kind of gave us that really good background on KTA-243, and it's, pretty well known that they have been collaborating with groups like BLACKCAT. So that's only going to force multiply what they're able to do. Now, this is a particular case related to BLACKCAT targeting a manufacturing sector client. And this one started with, the threat actor got in with legitimate credentials. Now, it's unclear, from our investigation of how they got those credentials, but it's, highly likely that could have been some kind of social engineering attempt. So, for us looking at kind of the activity on the network, it was highly suggested that there was, maybe an initial access broker had been in place here. So there was like some testing of those credentials. They came in, they tested the credentials, and then there was, kind of like nothing happened on the network for quite some time. In fact, it wasn't until about 6 weeks later that someone else logged in using those credentials. And that's where we began to see them deploying tools for data exfil, network discovery, and credential collection for lateral movement. Ultimately, during this time, they were able to exfiltrate about 600 gigabytes worth of data. And then in this particular case, BLACKCAT ransomware was deployed and encrypted the network. So that was, just that one case involving, potential social engineering there to get those credentials, resulting in BLACKCAT encryption. And then on the next slide here, I want to talk about another campaign that we were seeing in the third quarter around callback phishing. So this is not a new technique. There's been a couple groups that have used this particular technique to try to hook victims. In this particular campaign, actors were using auto renewal notifications for some popular fitness apps and streaming services. And the idea was that, the person would get this auto renewal. They would be worried, they wouldn't want their credit card to be charged for the service either that they didn't have or didn't know they have, and they would call a phone number. Now, when they would call this phone number, they would essentially be socially engineered to download a remote management tool. In these cases, the cases that were observed for this case study, we were seeing Zoho Assist was being used. Now, a couple things about this particular campaign, and we are looking at this. We're going to build this out hopefully for a blog post upcoming. But some of the patterns that we saw was them targeting legal entities, particularly senior leaders or senior partners in those legal entities. We also saw there were times where if the victim didn't call with the first auto renew notification, another one would be sent. So there was kind of like persistent targeting of these victims. Now, in these particular cases that we were seeing, the goal primarily seemed to be exfilling data. So it was get it on the system, exfil as much data as they can, and then they were coming back with some kind of a ransom demand. So there was definitely a financial motive here. Now, in this one, we weren't seeing any malware. But, obviously we do see malware in quite a bit of our cases. And I'm actually going to switch over for our next case study. We're going to be talking about Resida ransomware, and Ryan's going to talk us through that particular case study.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. So, looking here at a Resida case study, Resida itself, we observed or have observed impacting the healthcare sector in particular recently. And there have also been a few advisories as well published in open source for Resida in recent months. And in fact, just this morning, CISA and the FBI, in fact, published one of their kind of stop ransomware reports. So I recommend having a look through that if you're interested in this particular piece of malware. So at a high level look kind of here at one of our recent cases, the actors accessed the system likely through a vulnerability, and where they then created a new account on the system. Shortly after access, they deployed a number of tools in their toolkit, one of which being System BC, and a range of other tools, including Advanced Port Scanner for network discovery, AnyDesk for remote access, and MegaSync for exfiltration. And at the end, Resida successfully encrypted files across multiple hosts, and then the actors interestingly, right at the end, they changed the passwords to the system so that the employees or the IT staff were actually locked out and couldn't access the network. Something kind of additional on top of that kind of ransomware deployment, which is interesting to note here.
I think one of the most interesting things about this particular case is the use of System BC. We are investigating System BC in quite some detail, and hopefully we'll be releasing some more material on that very soon, sort of a threat actor's eye view of what they see when they deploy System BC. But we are starting to see System BC more and more. If we go to the next slide, I'll quickly run us through what we have this quarter for our malware collection. Now, I do want to just caveat some of these figures here, because this is what we are seeing in our casework, what we are seeing as part of the work that we do, but it's also augmented with some of our open source tracking and our C2 tracking that we do as well. So these aren't directly related to the number of times we see a particular malware in a case, but it's homogenized data. And of course, as Laurie said earlier, we do check this against what other firms are seeing as well. And maybe to not much surprise, Cobalt Strike remains sort of one of the top pieces of tooling malware that we're seeing. All of these malwares are really initial access stealer malware, again, designed to either exfiltrate credentials to then use those later, or provide initial access into a particular environment. Two big rises this time around is Peekabot and Darkgate. And one maybe obvious piece of malware that's missing here, and to those that have watched these briefings before, you probably could see it already, and that's Quackbot. So I spent an inordinate number of hours of my life tracking this particular piece of malware and the operators behind it. But of course, if you've been watching the news, earlier this year, Quackbot was disrupted by the US Justice Department and agencies from France, Germany, the Netherlands, UK, Romania, Latvia, to disrupt the botnets entirely, and actually in as many places as they could deploy a kill switch to uninstall Quackbot from those systems. As a 101 to how Quackbot worked, there were 3 tiers of command and control infrastructure. Tier 1 was a super node. That is just a infected device with a special module downloaded onto it to allow it to communicate it with other infected Quackbot machines. Then there was what's referred to as an upstream proxy, or tier 2. Those are more deliberately placed command and control servers on the internet, which proxy the traffic from those supernodes to deliver commands down to the end infected hosts. And tier 3 is the command and control interface. That's where the threat actors log in, can understand who's been infected, look at the data that's being collected from there. And essentially what this disruption did is it took out the tier 1 supernodes and the upstream proxies, essentially severing that connection from the command and control servers to the rest of the botnet. And they hijacked that connection and used that to deploy a kill switch to install Quackbot. What's particularly surprising is we track Quackbot very closely. We saw an increase in Quackbot infections all throughout this year, but the numbers are fairly staggering. FBI identified over 700,000 infected computers worldwide. That's a huge amount of infections. So obviously this is a very big disruption to the initial access broker market. And those threat actors are looking to replace Quackbot with a new piece of malware. And I'm going to hand it back to Ryan to take us through exactly what that new malware we think might be.
Yeah, thank you, George. And you mentioned as well we had an increase in Darkgate in our kind of overall collection, and Darkgate in general, what I'm mentioning perfectly fits in with the idea of this kind of evolving social engineering techniques this quarter, and that being the use of Microsoft Teams for initial access, which we saw during some Darkgate campaign a few months ago. So this technique really relies on Teams allowing external tenants to message inbound, which is something that may have been legitimately configured by the organization to connect with other companies. And the technique of using Teams is not too dissimilar really to email phishing, but perhaps Teams is more likely to work now compared to emails, as the sharing of files within Teams is quite normal and perhaps comfortable for users, so perhaps more likely to fall for those messages. I mentioned kind of Teams Fisher here, just one of those tools that's publicly available recently that can enable a threat actor to operationalize this social engineering technique, which has been seen in the wild. We've also published a blog post recently going into Darkgate and Teams in general. So it has some more examples of its use within other campaigns. And Darkgate itself was first publicly reported back in 2018. However, perhaps why we're seeing it this year, the author made a post early this year stating that they're moving to a subscription-based service. So essentially anyone could subscribe to using Darkgate and its capabilities. So perhaps why we're kind of seeing it kind of push out this year. And moving on to just on the next slide, looking at the attack chain from how we observed it, really start with those messages going into the victim via Teams. This is a link to a file within SharePoint. This leads to the file to the victim to the file in SharePoint. They download the file, which is a zip file. That contains an LNK file, which in turn executes a batch script. This downloads the auto IT interpreter from the adversary infrastructure, along with a number of auto IT scripts. And then right at the end, the interpreter itself runs those scripts, injects Darkgate payload into a running process, and then persistence is created through one of those scripts being located in the user start menu. So whenever they log in, the kind of process will start again and persistence is maintained. And so the key message really is to really focus on that stage one sort of social engineering through Teams, which, as you can see, could lead down this windy sort of trail to potentially impactful malware, in this case Darkgate. And the biggest mitigation really here is checking that configuration within Teams to not allow for external messaging inbound if it's not required. So, but if it is, perhaps considering allow listing for friendly domains to be able to actually kind of use that if you do require functionality for external connectivity in. So next up, just going to really cap off social engineering theme with multi-factor authentication or MFA. It's something that we also recently published a blog post on with some hardening controls. MFA, of course, being a very valid recommendation still to have. But what we've seen lately really highlights that threat actors can and do bypass MFA, but with some additional measures, we can help to reduce that risk, which we mentioned as a few controls later on. And we bring this up really as we've observed quite a big increase in adversary in the middle, phishing and business email compromise attacks in the last quarter. And the real big statistic here on bullet point 2 is that 90% of organizations that we saw affected by these attacks actually did have MFA in place at the time of unauthorized access, which is of course an interesting statistic in itself. And the techniques the threat actors used typically were sending a link to the victim with a credential landing page. And these would have been created by one of a number of toolkits listed here. So Evil Proxy, Evil Genix2, just a few that actors have used to sort of generate and proxy traffic within these campaigns. And these toolkits, when the user is entering credentials, the toolkits will proxy traffic between the credential hardening page and the actual legitimate service. So they'll pass on the credentials to the legitimate service, so the user actually thinks that they are logging into the legitimate service. However, the toolkit is then gathering in those credentials and MFA tokens and session tokens that the user is putting in. And the session token in particular can be reused then by the threat actor to log into the victim's account later on. And we also saw, which at the bottom, threat actors using MFA fatigue, which again is not necessarily a new technique, but this is just where the threat actor will have prior credentials. They will have access credentials in some way, perhaps another prior compromise, maybe a third-party compromise, or perhaps they've just purchased the credentials on the dark web, and they will then spam essentially MFA push notifications. And the user, they're just hoping that the user basically just accepts one of those notifications. They could perhaps script the MFA push notification, just hoping that the user will click accept at least once, and then they will then have access to the account. And that really kind of summarizes the social engineering. Again, we'll go into kind of MFA controls in a few slides, But for now, I'll just hand back to George just to go for the summary for this Q3.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so let's just quickly summarize what we've talked about today. I think one of the headline things is just the continued increase in email compromise and phishing that we're seeing quarter over quarter. 13% email compromise increase, 8% phishing increase. Of course, we've talked a lot about social engineering. That's dominated our casework and the news as well. And professional services continues to be the top impacted sector, probably because they service so many other organizations. Threat actors see that as a very high value target. So what can we do about this? For that, I'm going to hand it over to Keith. Over to you.
Thanks, George. And I know QuackBot, he's dedicated a lot of his life to QuackBot. So I was playing taps in the background here, honoring the death of QuackBot. So on to our next mission, George, for sure. So on that, due to the significant increase in social media attacks, the security validation team put together a guide containing tips to harden MFA and relevant solutions that can help. So a couple high-level overview of what we recommend. So we talk about block and sign-in attempts from high-risk countries. Depending on what conditional access policies you use to block in, we want to look at companies or organizations do not commonly do business. Avoid using weak MFA methods, call to the phone, text message to phone, SMS. And Ryan discussed that earlier. Risky sign-on and risky user-based conditional access policies. Trying to identify high-risk conditional access and require more secure MFA methods or just block them altogether. And then secure user MFA registration, limit the MFA registration or enrollment process to trusted locations, networks, countries, and really trying to deter actors from attempting to enroll in an MFA device using stolen creds, especially on the dark web. Block access to devices not meeting the organization's baseline security configuration requirements. So you want to ensure that devices not aligning with the existing compliant policies are marked as not compliant, because by default, devices not aligned with them existing compliance policy are usually marked as compliant. So I want to take a review of that. So the guide is available for download. It can be found in the handout section of the GoToWebinar, as I discussed earlier. If you want additional assistance in understanding these tips or how to implement them to relevant solutions, you can find contact info at the end of the guide. All right. After that, see here. I think we ran out of time. Well, we have a couple minutes actually here. So we have a couple questions that came in. One question that came in that I want to address is, unfortunately, the PowerPoint is not given publicly, but the webinar, like I said, is recorded. You can rewatch and you could take notes as needed. Unfortunately, the document is not. So we do have a couple questions. One question I thought is actually really good with everything that's going on today with the power of AI, ChatGPT. So how do we anticipate AI to impact social engineering? I'm going to turn that over to Laurie, because Laurie does a lot of this and has good visibility into it. So Laurie, I'm going to turn to you to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah. So when it comes to AI and social engineering, I think there's two things. I think one is that hopefully maybe like AI and things like that can help us get better at detecting when a user in our network is being manipulated like this. So perhaps helping us in prevention and like identification and prevention of these kind of events before they lead to something bad. But realistically speaking, we have to know that the red actors are going to use tools like AI to kind of force multiply what they're able to do. There are already tools. There is one that I know George has done some research on called Worm GPT, which is a version of ChatGPT that threat actors are using. I'm pretty sure I think in if you ask ChatGPT to create a phishing email, it won't do it. But if you ask that question in a certain way, create an email about this to a company like X, it will produce things like that. So there's definitely a risk there. The phishing emails are going to look more legitimate as well, because right now that's one of the way we tell users to detect those kind of emails. And if they look more realistic, that might be easier for them to get through. So that means that there will be need to be a lot more security and technical controls to catch that if they're able to get through to users.
Thanks, Laurie. Really appreciate that. So another question that came in, and George, I think you'd be good for this one, is talking about the toolkits that were deployed and looking at MDR and different detectors like Falcon or Sentinel-1. Can they circumvent endpoint detectors? Some of the toolkits we're talking about today.
Oh, yes, that's a good question. I think in some of the cases that we talked about today, there was no endpoint detection response tooling in place, so it's fairly easy to bypass it if it's not there, or you just have static kind of antivirus. But I think what's important to note is threat actors are using these legitimate tools for precisely that purpose. The fact that the organization A may be using those things already in their environment, they're popular tools, and so it's probably allow listed, or B, that it's seen as a legitimate tool, it's signed, there's likelihood that there's not going to be detections specifically made around it for the majority of environments. And so that's actually one of the things that we spend quite a lot of time doing in MDR land, is working with customers to figure out what tools are acceptable and what are used, and if we see any of these others, we should raise an alert and things like that. So EDR bypasses is it's their own webinar, but some of these tools are absolutely specifically chosen to slip under the radar.
Yeah, I know, and people are getting more and more sophisticated, and it's just it's just what it is, right? So one thing I want to address, I know I skipped it real quick, but I want to talk about that. I think is extremely important about everything we talked about today, especially with social engineering and how it's so impactful in the industry. Is some recommendations, and then what we basically on what we see working with our proactive team, our reactive team, and some of the research we do. So one thing that we tell a lot is about training, and awareness. But the key to implementing training and awareness is really coming from the top down, and you have to have the CEO or the board's buy-in and have them participate. So really providing that regular training and awareness is huge. Ensuring that detection with URL rewriting via email protection is good. Consider a FIDO hardware token for MFA. Looking at going down there, ensuring detection is in place. The Microsoft 365 Defender portal is great. So something that you really need to adhere to and looking into is really protection for social engineering. The authorization consent grants and Azure permissions, that PS1 is enormous. So make sure you have all these in place. And if you have any questions, Kroll's here to assist. So please reach out to us if you have any questions at any of these. It's vital to protecting yourself, especially from social engineering. So with that, let's see if we have any more questions here. There's one that came up that I thought was interesting, and Laurie, I'm gonna ask you this one if it's okay. Looking at some of the credentials. The credentials are, it's so hard to understand, how the credentials are and where you're going to get them from, and trying to understand, how they get from point A to point B and who gets them. So one question here is, let me pull it up. Sorry. Do you find legitimate credentials that have been hijacked or phished having local admin rights? As you know, local admin rights are huge, moving laterally through different types of domain controllers or file servers. Are you finding those at all when you're looking at some of these stolen credentials?
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the threat actor goal, is that they're trying to get those credentials that have, hopefully like global or some kind of IT admin rights. But the reality is that if they come in, as a user, a lot of groups, Scattered Spider is one specifically, they do so much recon once they get on the network, that, even if they come in with, kind of like a normal user capabilities, they're usually pretty good at being able to escalate into a role where they will have more privileges.
Yeah, and that you spot on with that. So sadly, with that, we've run out of time for today. A big thank you for everyone that has taken the time to tune in. We hope you found the session informative. Every week, the Kroll CTI team discusses weekly current trends on our weekly briefing. It's called In the Trenches, which is published on Wednesdays on LinkedIn. Have a listen if you want to mature your security and learn more about the hot topics that we're seeing in cybersecurity. So we've also published our Q3 2023 threat landscape report on the Kroll website. So if you want to get into more details about the trends we've outlined today, then please have a read of the report. You can also find a copy of it in the handout section in the GoToWebinar. Also, in the handout section is a copy of the recommendations for MFA or MFA hardening. So please take a look at that and download. When you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on this session, as it really helps us prepare for future sessions and know what you're interested in, what you want to talk about that we're seeing. Once again, thanks a lot for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again in one of the future briefings.